Something strange is happening across South Florida's waterways. In neighborhoods where green iguanas once crowded every seawall, canal bank, and suburban garden, populations are thinning in ways that are catching researchers and wildlife managers off guard. Camera traps set along Miami-Dade County's drainage corridors are recording fewer animals. Field surveys that once logged dozens of sightings per hour are coming back with significantly lower counts. Long-term monitoring stations established by university researchers and state wildlife agencies are flagging declines in localized populations that, just a decade ago, seemed completely unstoppable. For a species that colonized South Florida so thoroughly that it became part of the regional landscape, this shift demands an explanation. And that explanation, it turns out, is far more complicated and far more fascinating than most people assume. To understand why iguanas are disappearing in certain areas, you first have to understand how they got there and why they thrive so explosively in the first place. The green iguana is not native to Florida. It originates from the tropical forests and coastal lowlands of Central and South America, ranging from southern Mexico all the way down through Brazil. The species arrived in Florida through the exotic pet trade during the late 1960s, when juvenile iguanas were being sold across the United States as novelty pets. Florida, and particularly the Miami metropolitan area, became a central hub for these imports. Small and manageable as hatchlings, many were released deliberately or escaped into the surrounding environment as they grew too large for owners to handle. By the early 1970s, isolated sightings were being reported in suburban neighborhoods. No wildlife official at the time would have predicted that these scattered releases were laying the foundation for one of the most successful reptile invasions in the history of North America. The reason for their success was not luck. It was biological compatibility. South Florida's subtropical climate closely mirrors the conditions of the iguana's native range. Average winter temperatures in the region rarely fall below 15 degrees Celsius, which sits comfortably within the species' thermal tolerance range. Unlike many invasive species that require years of adaptation before establishing stable populations, green iguanas required almost none. The food was already there in the form of ornamental plants like hibiscus, bougainvillea, and citrus that lined residential gardens across Broward County and Palm Beach County. The nesting habitat was already there in the loose, sandy soils along canal construction zones and landscape developments. The movement corridors were already there in the form of South Florida's vast engineered canal network, originally built for flood control but now serving as ecological highways for a reptile that needed only sunlight, vegetation, and warm water nearby. Through the 1980s, breeding populations stabilized. Through the 1990s, they expanded northward and into the Florida Keys. By the early 2000s, population surveys conducted by the University of Florida's Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences Extension Program and the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission were documenting densities that defied conventional invasive species modeling. Some urban canal zones were recording more than 100 individual iguanas per hectare, a level of vertebrate density more commonly associated with insect colonies. State-level estimates climbed into the hundreds of thousands and, under favorable seasonal conditions, potentially beyond 1 million individuals. The invasion had transformed from a biological curiosity into a structural problem embedded across an entire region. The ecological damage that followed was significant and multifaceted. Female iguanas excavate burrow tunnels up to 2 meters long in canal banks, levees, and seawalls. Engineering assessments from South Florida municipalities have repeatedly linked this burrowing activity to soil destabilization, with cumulative repair costs reaching hundreds of thousands of dollars annually in heavily affected counties. The damage accumulates quietly, forming underground voids that only become apparent after heavy rainfall or storm surge events. Beyond infrastructure, iguanas impose sustained herbivory pressure on both ornamental and native vegetation. In monitored natural zones, repeated feeding on preferred plant species has been documented to slow regeneration rates, gradually shifting the botanical composition of riparian corridors over time. Add to this the public health dimension, green iguanas are known salmonella carriers, and the picture of an invasive species fully embedded in human-dominated landscapes becomes clear. In 2019, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission made a landmark policy decision. It removed green iguanas from the state's protected species list for private land, effectively allowing year-round removal without a permit. This triggered a rapid expansion of professional iguana removal services across South Florida, with contractors charging between $50 and $150 per animal depending on access and density. Coordinated culling operations in high-density suburban zones reported removing hundreds of animals in single efforts. Statewide, annual removals reached into the tens of thousands, creating the impression of meaningful progress. But the numbers told a more complicated story. Removal efforts were geographically fragmented, driven by private property demand rather than ecological strategy. One neighborhood would aggressively cull while an adjacent block did nothing. Because iguanas are highly mobile along canal systems and drainage infrastructure, cleared zones were consistently reinvaded from surrounding untreated areas. Wildlife biologists describe the dynamic using population modeling concepts. Removal reduces current density, but reproduction restores it to equilibrium within a single breeding cycle. A single female produces between 20 and 70 eggs per clutch, with multiple clutches possible each year in Florida's warm climate. Even assuming juvenile mortality rates of 70 to 80%, the reproductive surplus ensures continuous population replacement. Culling, without addressing reproduction or habitat, functions as pressure modulation rather than population control. So if large-scale human intervention has not produced the observed declines in localized populations, what is actually driving them? The answer sits at the intersection of predation ecology, environmental constraints, and a biological vulnerability that even a highly successful invasive species cannot fully overcome. Start at the nest. This is where the iguana population is most exposed, and this is where the most consequential predation pressure occurs. Raccoons are among the most effective nest predators operating in South Florida's urban and semi-urban landscapes. Female iguanas preferentially select loose, sandy soils for egg deposition, which are often the same disturbed substrates created by canal construction and residential landscaping. These nesting locations are predictable. Raccoons, which are highly olfactory hunters, detect the scent of freshly turned soil and organic traces left during the egg-laying process. Once a nest is located, a single raccoon can excavate and consume an entire clutch of 20 to 70 eggs within minutes. Field experiments conducted in Florida monitoring sites have demonstrated that when raccoon access to nesting zones is experimentally restricted, iguana hatchling recruitment rates increase sharply, in some cases doubling or tripling within a single breeding season. This establishes raccoons not merely as opportunistic egg consumers but as active regulators of population entry. They are functioning as a demographic bottleneck at the base of the recruitment pipeline. The pressure continues past hatching. Hatchling iguanas, typically under 20 centimeters in length, emerge from nests in synchronized pulses following incubation periods of roughly 90 days. These emergence events are brief and concentrated, occurring most often at dawn or dusk. For ground-level predators adapted to urban environments, this represents a high-density prey event within a narrow time window. Feral cats, which are ubiquitous across Miami-Dade and Broward County neighborhoods, are visually oriented hunters highly capable of intercepting small, fast-moving prey. In areas where natural vegetation has been replaced by lawns and low ornamental plantings, hatchlings moving away from nest sites have minimal cover and are highly exposed to cat predation. Free-ranging dogs contribute opportunistically. Rat snakes and other constrictors patrol vegetated corridors and canal banks, entering burrows and ambushing juveniles in less urbanized zones. None of these species eliminates large numbers independently, but together they form what ecologists describe as a distributed mortality filter, removing a substantial proportion of individuals during the most vulnerable stage of the life cycle. Above this ground layer, aerial predation introduces a different kind of pressure. The great horned owl is the most impactful avian predator operating in South Florida's canal-lined landscapes. With a wingspan approaching 1.5 meters and talons capable of generating considerable crushing force, it is physically capable of taking prey that most raptors cannot manage. More importantly, its sensory system gives it a pronounced hunting advantage in low-light conditions. Asymmetrical ear placement allows precise sound triangulation in near darkness, meaning that the subtle rustling of a juvenile iguana repositioning on a branch at dusk can be enough to trigger a strike. These owls establish territories along canal corridors and return to the same perching zones night after night, creating localized pockets of elevated juvenile mortality that operate consistently across seasons. In zones with resident owl pairs, hatchling and subadult survival rates can be measurably lower than in comparable habitats without them. Red-shouldered hawks and other diurnal raptors contribute additional pressure, though their hunting strategies and activity windows limit their impact to transitional periods. Beyond biological predation, environmental constraints impose their own mortality pressures, and periodically with dramatic results. Green iguanas are ectothermic, meaning they are entirely dependent on external heat sources to maintain body temperature. When ambient temperatures approach or fall below 10 degrees Celsius, their muscle function deteriorates to the point of near paralysis. During cold snaps, which do periodically sweep through South Florida during unusual winter fronts, iguanas become immobilized on branches, fences, and canal banks. They lose grip and fall. Mass mortality events associated with these cold episodes have been documented in Florida wildlife reports, with large numbers of animals dying across affected zones in a matter of hours. These events are irregular and geographically uneven in their impact, and populations rebound in subsequent warm seasons. But in years where cold events are particularly severe or persistent, the localized population crashes can be dramatic, and recovery is not always complete before the next cold cycle. Disease and parasites represent a less visible but ongoing mortality factor. While large-scale disease outbreaks in Florida's wild iguana populations are not well documented in the scientific literature, individual mortality from infection and parasitic load is a consistent background pressure. Reptile disease ecology remains less studied than mammalian or avian pathology, but the available evidence suggests that immune stress during cold periods or high population density conditions can increase susceptibility, adding to baseline attrition. What emerges from this full picture is a paradox. Iguanas face mortality from multiple directions simultaneously: nest predation by raccoons, hatchling predation by cats and snakes, juvenile predation by owls and raptors, cold-induced mass mortality events, disease, and aggressive human culling. Yet for most of the past 2 decades, these combined pressures were insufficient to suppress the population at the regional scale. The reproductive rate was simply too high. The habitat was too compatible. The dispersal corridors were too extensive. Even as mortality rates climbed, the system kept replacing losses faster than they accumulated. What has changed in areas where declines are now being recorded is the convergence of multiple pressure categories operating simultaneously in the same locations. Intensified nest destruction programs targeting high-density zones are disrupting recruitment. Sustained regional culling operations, where they have been maintained consistently rather than applied sporadically, are reducing adult breeding populations faster than reproduction can compensate. Cold weather mortality has been unusually significant in recent winter seasons in certain corridors. And ecological changes in the landscape itself, as invasive plant management restores some native vegetation structure, are reducing the quality of available habitat in specific zones. No single factor is responsible. The declines are the product of compound pressure, each element individually insufficient, but collectively capable of tipping local population dynamics. The broader management picture reflects this complexity. Researchers and wildlife agencies have increasingly shifted their language from eradication to sustained suppression, acknowledging that a species as reproductively robust and ecologically adaptable as the green iguana cannot realistically be eliminated from South Florida. The goal is to reduce populations to levels where infrastructure damage, ecological competition with native species, and public health exposure are meaningfully reduced, while accepting that the species will remain part of the landscape in some form. Achieving even this more modest target requires a layered, coordinated strategy targeting reproduction through nest detection and destruction, reducing adult populations through sustained regional culling, modifying habitat through iguana-resistant landscaping and infrastructure reinforcement, and expanding monitoring systems using drones and camera technology to track population dynamics with greater precision. Experimental approaches including fertility control and behavioral deterrence are under active investigation, though none has reached implementation at meaningful scale. Predator support through habitat enhancement for species like the great horned owl is being considered in some management frameworks, though predation alone has consistently proven insufficient to function as a controlling force. What Florida is experiencing with the green iguana is ultimately a case study in the limits of ecological resilience. The species exploited a set of conditions that were perfectly aligned for invasion success. It colonized human infrastructure, fed on human landscaping, and reproduced at rates that overwhelmed every natural check the system could produce. And yet, decades later, under sufficient and sustained compound pressure from human management, environmental mortality, and the grinding cumulative work of predators focused on the most vulnerable life stages, localized populations are beginning to contract. The real predator-driving iguana decline in South Florida is not any single species. It is the convergence of forces, biological, environmental, and human, that the iguana's extraordinary reproductive success was, for a long time, powerful enough to outpace. Now, in places where those forces align with enough consistency, the balance is beginning to shift.